something very important happened with the formation of the United States Constitution.
Yeah.
And if there was anything that was this far from being a miracle, you could point to that as that. And that comes from a kind of maybe standard,
I think
history.
Americanism is exactly where I want to point, because, and it's not an accident that the post-liberals, when they're hammering away at liberalism, they almost never actually talk about anything associated with Americanism. They always talk about early British liberals, or they talk about early British liberals, or they talk about the French Revolution. They do not talk about anything associated with Americanism.
I've always been fascinated about, and I can understand why this is the case, but I still don't understand why it's the case, how prominent the French Revolution becomes as a historical event when, not that long before, right happening at the same time, was what turned out to be a much more important event.
Right.
And that was the formation of the
Welcome to Grill Country. My guest today is Dr. Jim, who I first met at the Chino conference. We had some nice conversations there, and we reconnected again recently. We both independently had conversations with Sam Tiedemann, and we were expressing very, very similar kind of adjacent concerns and thinking along parallel paths. And so I reached out to Dr. Jim and told him how much I appreciated his conversation with Sam. He reached out to me and said he felt likewise about mine. And he had some thoughts that he wanted to share today. And we're going to have a conversation about these things that have been catching our attention and see if we can make some sense of it together. So welcome to Grill Country, Dr. Jim.
Thank you, Nate. And it's good to talk with you again. As I had said, and I had mentioned to Sam, I'm going to be at the Midwestuary conference. I'm looking forward to that. My journey with the corner has been, I've been there from pretty much the beginning, but have drifted back a little bit for, life circumstances mostly, frankly, but also other reasons. And with the Midwestuary being, with the kind of array of guests, very attractive, but also another chance to connect with everybody again. I knew that there would be a lot of the regulars there that I could reconnect with, and so
almost all of them. I don't know how many of the regulars I've talked to who aren't going. It's crazy. So it's going to be. I don't know what the overall attendance is going to be, but like pretty much all the people that you know about are going to be there.
Yeah. I could tell that just by the list of speakers, and so I was really looking forward to that. So I wanted to kind of lean back into the corner a bit, get myself a little bit more familiar with the crowd. And at the same time, I've been kind of working on expressing my own ideas in a different way, different mode. And I've been writing and posting things on Substack. And it's been an interesting experience because I don't know if you've spent time. I think you have spent time writing, Nate. Have you?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah. And it's an exploratory experience. You learn as much about what you want to try to say as you go along, and realizing that you're revealing to yourself something about yourself when you write things, and then you feel like you want to do more, or you feel like you want to get to more nuance in what you're trying to articulate, and that then I think focuses and brings into more clarity what you really think about these things. So it's been a interesting experience to write and post on Substack. But one of the trends that has come through that is this narrative or this discourse that you and I both kind of bumped into together when we talked to Sam. And my synopsis of it would be something like that I'm noticing. I mean, it's not anything but I think pretty obvious or evident that there's a conversation that's been going on for a while, a discourse, I'll call it, or a kind of an approach or rhetoric that's been, beyond the corner, but also in the corner, which I'll list in 3 different categories. But I think they have a similar kind of theme to them. One is the notion that Paul regularly indicates that we've moved past the modern, and that there's something to grapple with there, that we've moved past the modern.
Mm-hmm.
The other is that we are living in the inheritance of the disenchanted world, and that now, given this late stage of, let's say, late stage of modernism, there's a realization of a re-enchantment, let's say, or let's say there's an impulse to try and see whether there's a possibility of re-enchantment. And then the third is this notion that we are a post-liberal, that we've moved past the post-war consensus, and that we need to start formulating our self-understanding in this age as, in those terms. And I think all three of those impulses are kind of related to each other. This kind of notion that there's something, kind of deeply flattened about the modern perspective, and that has left us with a kind of dead world, or a world with, no way to avoid a kind of drift towards a nihilistic view of things, and that we need to move, that the modern is responsible for that in some sort of way, and that then we need to try to come close to, move towards, recognize that we're moving past all this in the form that I just described. And I feel like that discourse is, I think that discourse is not particularly credible, and it's a rhetorical strategy in my mind. And I wanted to try to articulate the strategy that I think it is, and then articulate my own view.
I want to start with the last one you mentioned, because that's the one to me that is very clearly a rhetorical strategy. This framing of post-war consensus seems to have been an intentional reduction of the history of liberalism to the era of time where conservatives are most dissatisfied, to treat it as if it was representative of our entire history as a people with liberalism. And to me, that is the one that is it's an obvious rhetorical strategy. And the people who engage in it, they do strange things, because the people who engage in talking about the failure of the post-war consensus and are busy chopping away at foundational myths, American myths that have shaped our national identity in the late modern period, are the very same people who will talk about how unfortunate it is that we have deconstructed the myths of the past. So they'll want to recover the myths of the past while they're destroying the myths that are currently upholding their culture, and talking about how terrible it is to deconstruct myths. So which is it? It's you're perfectly fine taking a sledgehammer to the myths that are upholding the civilization you're living in now, and you're calling yourself a traditionalist, but you're actually taking the tradition that you've been handed and basically wanting to throw it in the trash bin, and which is a very strange sort of traditionalism. So to me, it's very much that one. To me, is very clearly it's a rhetorical technique that is driving toward an agenda. And I notice Paul keeps talking about it, and it bothers me that he can, because I just don't even want to accept that framing. I don't even want to, because the people who have set up that framing, it's obvious that they're doing within an agenda, and it's no, let's try to talk about the history of our experience in modernity and liberalism without truncating everything to this tiny narrow window of time, and to think that, well, that's obviously this is the only thing that liberalism can offer us, is the things that you're upset about that has happened in this very, very comparatively small slice of time.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think when you were talking to Sam, framed it perhaps in one way that's good to formulate this, and that is that it has at its base a kind of resentment that is driving it, and yes, that then makes it makes it more an emotional response in a certain sense than it is a rational response to what's going on. And, and I see that in a lot of the rhetoric, and I agree with you on that.
Yeah. And, I noticed Paul used the term again today in his video. I didn't watch all of the proceedings that he played afterwards, but I did watch the part where he was talking in his video about like what had happened at Synod. And he flat out said that conservatives in the CRC have rejected the post-war consensus. Okay, so it's like, A, why are you buying into that framing? And is it really all conservatives that are actually rejecting like the post-war consensus? And what do you think the post-war consensus is? And also when is the post-war consensus? Do you really think 1955 was the same as 1975 and there's no difference between those two times? Yeah. So, I mean, it's just...
Yeah, a lot of this is...
It doesn't work for me at all. Yeah, I really... Yeah.
I agree with that. And I do think that there's there has to be a point of pausing and saying, all right, what are the values that we're going to try to, keep at the center of our political life and our understanding of our personal relationship to the culture. And it does seem to me that there's a willingness to kind of caricature a certain aspect of our present culture, a certain aspect of the liberal ideas as responsible for things that we obviously don't like about our present age, but then act out kind of in resentment to turn against those core principles rather than, come up with a positive formulation of what it is we're going to do about our present situation.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And there's also a kind of an irony to it too, because I would say that this moment looks to me a lot like the 60s, because it's actually, again, it's the young people that are driving this desire for rapid change. Mm-hmm. And it's actually quite radical. It's radical in a reactionary direction instead of being radical in a progressive direction, but it's still radical. And it's still like probably too rapid a movement that is not really very carefully thought out.
Yeah, no one seems to be able to articulate a positive formulation of what they want in replacement. And it's kind of why I thought a little bit that to call myself a reactionary modern, was softly provocative in a certain sense, because I'm really wanting to take those core values that they seem ready to throw over and just say, well, no, I'm wanting to defend those. And in a reactionary mode, it's also the case that reactionaries are often on the losing side of things, at least at the moment of their being reactionary. So they will defend on principle, in a sense, against a tide that seems to be, kind of moving away from them, if you will, or whatever. So that's kind of why I kind of coined that characterization of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, to be very blunt about it, if you look at the political leanings of the younger generations, it seems like we have on the progressive side, we have people that are basically Marxists, and on the right on the right wing side, we have people that are basically fascists. Yeah, and we're tending toward these extremes, and
moving to a point of being totally willing to self-identify with the fullness of those ideologies, rather than, be equivocate about it or whatever. Just be upfront about it.
Right. And the fact that some of this movement on the right wing maintains like some sort of like nominal association with Christianity and wants to label itself Christian doesn't make me feel any better about it. Because, the Nazis did that too. The Nazis just tried to fix Christianity to make Christianity fit Nazi ideology. Like, that's what they did.
Sure.
They still considered themselves Christian, except for a very tiny handful that were blunt about the anti-Christian nature of what they were doing, but they kept the Christian trappings on the outside. And so just embracing the label Christian, if what you're doing is embracing what is indistinguishable from a classic blood and soil fascism as your politics, it's like the fact that you call yourself a Christian doesn't make me feel any better about it. Actually, in fact, makes me feel worse about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I do think there's a kind of another, there's a kind of, broader kind of cultural zeitgeist that seems to be collecting around this as well. I mean, I don't know how you'll react to this, and I want to maybe take back half of it before I even say it. But
we're thinking out loud, so don't worry about it.
But you know, there's the ortho bros. Yep. There's the, you know, and again, gosh, I recognize that impulse to gravitate towards that sacramental sense of things, and you know, and the Protestants disappointed by their you know, what they were given in their formation, moving towards this more sacramental or high church Catholicism, even or orthodoxy. It kind of seems like it feels like the same impulse. In certain cases, it gets made explicit as this more fascist or more kind of hardened right wing move, but the whole thing seems to be a general trend. Right,
it's a general cultural trend that's like it. And I don't know how. Let me ask you this, Jim: how much do you encounter it in real life versus online?
Basically not at all.
right.
Yeah.
So
anyway,
why is that? Why is that, do you think?
Well, you know, I have my own particular circumstance in which, of course, we're all that way. I always want to couch things that way, but you know, I do think that we live in a age of, you know, kind of a technocratic culture in which our communities are structured for us by the late capitalist, you know, kind of world that we live in. Our employment becomes a central part of our, you know, kind of a significant part of our daily experience, and that is structured in that way. And that is, you know, that doesn't lend itself to, you know, being self-consciously metaphysical, let's say. And so I live in a world in which there's a lot of people around me who I know because I've known them for a long time, and ultimately come to find what their, you know, religious convictions are or lack of religious convictions are. But that doesn't play into, you know, kind of daily converse. And so on the other hand, I would say, particularly around COVID, there was a, you know, kind of boiling up of this stuff with the conflicts of, you know, decision making that came, you know, down from on high and impacted people directly. And some people, not many, it turned out, but some people kind of made personal life decisions impacted by their, you know, kind of deeply held ideological commitments. Some of those were religious in terms of, you know, what even employment choices. And I had a very close colleague, a friend, who ended up leaving. You know, I'd worked with him for 20 years, and it ended up separating us. He had to go work somewhere else because of, you know, kind of demands of the institution that forced him to make a decision. Right. You can probably imagine what that decision centered around.
No, I actually think this is a good thing to talk about, Jim. But I'll tell you why. Because here's the thing: like the things that have pissed us all off over the last 5 or 6 years, right?
Yeah,
or maybe longer, is the woke left movement, and what many people, myself included, perceive as like an extremely authoritarian way of handling the COVID crisis.
Yep.
And so those things that we were mad about, we were both mad about them because we perceived them as being illiberal. Yeah. That's why they pissed us off. Yeah. So please tell me if you're mad. if you're still like have lingering anger over woke leftism and COVID restrictions, why in God's name would post-liberalism be what you want to push for?
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense. And so this is what I mean by I think it's got a heavy emotional content to it. And maybe a lot of our decision making and our self-understanding and our actions within our kind of worldviews do come out of that. We react in that way. But yeah, I think you're right about that. I do think that things over my experience is that things do kind of come in waves. They come and go in terms of their intensity, and maybe we are not as far from the center of our thinking about these things as we might imagine at times. But
yeah, it's hard to tell because I don't know that the fact that it's mostly you see it online, I don't know that doesn't mean it's still not widespread, because here's the thing. First of all, at this point in history, almost everybody is online.
Yep.
So it's like online people are real people. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yes, there are things that happen that drive things online, but if you're seeing something that is a really, really noticeable trend online, it probably exists in reality. And the reason that people aren't talking to you about it at coffee hour at church is that, first of all, I don't know about your church, but we don't really talk about politics that often. And so it doesn't come. I do talk about politics with my priest all the time. My priest is like so I don't like, I should, okay, hashtag not all post-liberals. Okay. So, but let me, this is my disclaimer. It's like, my priest is a post-liberal of the kind of Adrian Paps, John Milbank, Anglican variety, which is this kind of like the soft left post-liberalism that is essentially doesn't want to overturn any of the fundamental constitutional structures of representative democracy, it still wants to maintain religious tolerance, all that kind of thing. And that it just wants to have like a more virtue-oriented politics.
Yep.
It doesn't want to do anything that radically. It calls itself post-liberal. It's really mostly reacting to the neoliberal consensus of the past 40 years and wanting to address the issues that it sees with that. I have different ideas than that movement does about the role of markets. I'm much more classically liberal in my view of markets, but I don't see the political ideas coming from that camp as like beyond the pale, outside of the realm of discussion. So, so my priest and I argue back and forth mainly about whether he's really a liberal or not, because I actually think the definition of liberalism that school of post-liberalism he's using is just a straw man. It doesn't really accurately define liberalism. And the fact that you can point to some of the foundational principles of liberalism existing before liberalism doesn't mean that unique combination of things is not legitimately the heritage of liberalism. Right? So that because you can find pre-liberal policies of religious tolerance, like you can cite Theodosius, for example, as for religious tolerance. Okay, because Theodosius had religious tolerance, doesn't mean that religious tolerance combined with representative democracy, combined with free markets, isn't liberalism. If you want all of those things still, you're some kind of liberal, and to call yourself a post-liberal is really just you're playing a semantic game at that point.
My experience recent years, maybe going back through COVID, and I don't know exactly how this touches on exactly the COVID dynamic, because I'm in a very unique situation relative to that, being a physician. But I think I've told this story before, and I'll try to be brief about it. I come from a kind of a very untroubled secular formation. I grew up in a family that didn't go to church. We didn't talk about religious issues. There was nothing confessional about my experience. There was no moment at which anyone, my parents or anyone else, was going to come to me and say, declare belief in this cosmology with your mouth or whatever. That was never part of the way I experienced my growing up. And that secular background it didn't seem, and I still look back on it as lacking anything. It had a very solid ethical construct that was both explicit in some parts of it, but implicit, and had family values and, kind of trying to achieve and support your families financially and, all that kind of stuff. So I don't come from a kind of a circumstance in which I have a problematic relationship with Christianity in a sense. I don't come from being embedded in a Christian tradition and then feeling threatened by the secular world. And I don't come from a tradition of being embedded in a Christian tradition and then deconstructing and then having a complex relationship backwards to my formation. I don't have either of those experiences. And I think that does color my way of viewing things. And and I was brought up in an education that I think was very standard. It wasn't very deep in terms of civics and the learning of history, but it did have some depth to it. And I think over time, particularly in recent years, I came to realize how deeply embedded in my kind of psyche and my emotional understanding of the things that are possible within human history, my deep sense that, something very important happened with the formation of the United States Constitution.
Yeah.
And if there was anything that was this far from being a miracle, you could point to that as that. And that comes from a kind of maybe standard, history.
Americanism is exactly where I want to point, because, and it's not an accident that the post-liberals, when they're hammering away at liberalism, they almost never actually talk about anything associated with Americanism. They always talk about early British liberals, or they talk about early British liberals, or they talk about the French Revolution. They do not talk about anything associated with Americanism.
I've always been fascinated about, and I can understand why this is the case, but I still don't understand why it's the case, how prominent the French Revolution becomes as a historical event when, not that long before, right happening at the same time, was what turned out to be a much more important event. Right. And that was the formation of the United States.
And I think here's the thing: the fact that one of those things happened in Europe, and actually this I think leads us into your piece that you wrote that you showed me earlier today. So I think this is like the good transition point to get into that.
Yeah.
The difference is that one of these things happened in the old world,
right?
That had a very ancient culture with a tradition that reached back a long time, and so. That being
very much ossified, and had all sorts of structures that just, seemed to present people with the need to burn it all down, because otherwise it wasn't going to get out of their way.
Right. Whereas and it's important to note that the old world has pagan roots. I talked about this with Sam too. It's when you have something happen in the old world, the gods of the nations are at play. Yeah. Well, what happened on our soil was an entirely inter-Christian affair. Absolutely. That's one of the reasons it's different, because both sides in the conflict were Christian.
Right.
And there was no history of anyone involved in that conflict having ever been anything else. And the people that were in that land were in this very much in a sense of a new land, and there was no like deep connection to the gods of the land.
Yeah, and I think in that piece I was trying to capture, and I want to do a little more of this with my other writing, but there's a certain tragedy on both sides of the Atlantic, let's say.
Yeah.
And when I say I'm a liberal and a classical liberal, I'm talking about the principles embedded in the Constitution. I'm not really talking about the way in which that birth of those ideas ended up playing out in history, because the way they ended up playing out in history is that they kind of deconstructed the Catholic Church, they deconstructed the monarchy. The state was born in the 19th century. The state progressed through to give us the conflagration of the First and the Second World Wars.
I think the modern state formed earlier than that. I think really actually right before the Reformation. The birth of the state really is when you move from traditional monarchy to the kind of late medieval divine right of kings monarchy. That's the beginning of
the Glorious Revolution in England. Perhaps you would.
Yeah. I mean, there's something changes there. For sure.
But my point there is that, in a certain sense, if you started at the Reformation, you could start it going. You go to Scotus, or you could go to Machiavelli, or you can start this off in arbitrary different places. But a certain kind of process got started, or at least in retrospect, we see it, that played itself out in a kind of way in which Europe became decadent and then kind of had to go through this meat grinder of a historical process that, in a certain sense, can be labeled as ending with the end of the Second World War. And that's what that piece that I was writing about is. And I think The Third Man is trying to say something like that. And the United States didn't need to go through that version of that. They didn't have to have their idols, talk about for the sake of the audience, you just referenced The Third Man. Talk about your thoughts about The Third Man so kind of let the audience in on that. So The Third Man is a film that was based on a narrative by a Catholic. I don't know if you'd call it him a committed Catholic, but a Catholic author, Graham Greene, famous 20th century Catholic author. He wrote the text of the play, the screenplay, and it's a film that is about post World War II Vienna. It's immediate post World War II. The town, Vienna is just bombed out, and all of the old markers of the European history are kind of in ruins, as is the kind of the people living there. And there's a kind of a continuous emphasis of the decadence of Europe at that moment in Europe, and it's also kind of fallen apart. So that
something I picked up on, Jim, is there's a specific contrast between that what you're talking about, the image of the decadence of Europe, and the American character who, as you observed in your piece, is naive. But it's also important to note the fact that he writes Western novels.
Yes,
is not accidental.
Graham Greene is
bringing it a focus.
And the movie is from a European perspective, and it's a European perspective of recognizing that it was over in Europe. It was dead in Europe, and that history was dead. And there's a tragedy in that death, let's say, because what we lose is not just, we lose it for a good reason, because it had become corrupt, and that is, imagined in the form of this very charismatic character played by Orson Welles, who is, he's attractive and he's capable and he's a bon vivant and he's Orson Welles after all, and yet he's also deeply, deeply corrupt. And the message of it is that in the end, for whatever reason, maybe nobody's fault, maybe history's fault, all that was good in Europe was going to be lost because of the corruption that ultimately had been so deeply embedded in that history. And it manifests itself in World War II. And that was too much in your face with the Holocaust and the inability or the fact that historical trend of all those values and the aesthetics of high culture and the philosophy and the smart Germans who could write, Goethe and all of the smart, Germany was the highest of the high culture in the 19th century. And yet that culture still ended up in that degradation. And the Holly Martin character, who's the American, it's a fun movie. It's not you watch it and you don't feel it being serious, but it's a very serious film because Holly Martin is both, you called him naive, but he's also not attractive. He's boring and he's banal and he's not a romantic hero. And he's the one who kills off Harry Lime in the end. It's a mercy killing essentially. And we're left with, and this is an image of America from Europe, an image of America as a kind of the ugly American image. And that's what's left after it's all over. So in a certain sense, and the reason I wrote this was, and put this in our conversation here, is that the process that we've gone through historically, now I'm setting aside the principles that I still am committed to, but the process that we've gone through leaves us, it shows us that the history is a tragedy in the end.
Right.
And I don't know if that was clear the way I expressed it.
No. Yeah, you expressed it very clearly. Yeah, it is. And here's the thing. Here's an irony. So we find ourselves in a moment that is where it's not unlike the moment that faced Germany prior to the rise of the Third Reich, where you have this kind of like disillusionment with liberalism, and fascism rose up in this period of disillusionment with liberalism. Now, I don't think that liberalism was nearly as established or robust or in any way close to in German soil in the 1930s compared to what it is here now. And hopefully
there was some of it. There was certainly a decadence in the liberalism that the fascists were reacting against.
Yes.
And we see that decadence in our own culture now. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But here's the thing: is that where are the post-liberal thinkers turning for their political ideas for inspiration? They're going back to old Europe.
Yeah.
They're ignoring. They're absolutely 100% ignoring American ideas in favor of importing ideas from Europe. Post-liberal thinkers are either, like the more mild form of post-liberals, are mainly influenced by thinkers that are coming from out of the UK, that are drawing from British ideas. The more extreme ones are drawing from, Italian from Italian political. There's a lot of borrowing from Italian political theory, and some of the ugly Italian political theory, like you see, like even Paul on his channel has been talking about ideas from Pareto, and Pareto laid the intellectual foundations for Italian fascism. It's like, why are we talking about Pareto like his ideas are important and good? Because we know where they lead.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of drawing from Evola. I mean, it's just like all of these right-wing reactionary ideas are getting imported from European thinkers, Germans, Italians, Brits. And there's not much drawing on our own traditions.
I am, again, I would say that I'm this reactionary liberal, meaning I want to just actively be affirmative about those principles, not this history that I just laid out, but the principles. And I'm going to still be committed to that, even as I realize that there could be a trend in an opposite direction. So I still hold to that. But the reason I set this up this way is that I'm going to talk about what I think is an intrinsic problem of liberalism that the American history, I think, does display for us and needs an answer. And to some degree, this whole list that you were just giving is, kind of the Wild West of people trying to provide those answers.
Right.
In the very first conversation that I had with Paul, I was talking about the I was talking about the fact that the Puritans came to America not to give up their Puritanism. They came to America because they were being oppressed by other Christians in Europe, and they needed a space to be Puritans.
Yes.
And of course, the liberal construct gets set up such that the state would protect that community's ability to be Puritan.
Right.
The problem with that is that when you have such a large neutral commons, the Puritans naturally, almost by entropy, drift apart. Holding that community together is an act of will that perhaps is not even possible. And we've seen that in the kind of repeated schisms of the various Christian denominations. I'm not blaming this entirely on the United States, but in that kind of liberal context where you have a neutral commons, then the only thing that's holding communities together is their own willpower as a community. And you can kind of see that in what's happening for Paul in the CRC. Mm-hmm. And what ultimately may be the end product of that history is that the liberal kind of commons doesn't give any support for us to do anything but drift into a lukewarm commonality. And so the tools to keep communities together are maybe lacking in that. And I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but it does seem to me that the reaction in the other direction is trying to push against that kind of, entropic diffusion of communities. If you remember, Tocqueville kind of talks about one of the essence of the American that he saw was that there were all these associations that were so strong.
Right. Yeah.
And I think we've gone now in late liberalism to a point where there aren't there's not the infrastructure for us to hold these kinds of communities together. I don't know how that.
No, that's good. No, that's good.
I think that resonates a little bit with what you were talking about with this gentleman, was Walsh?
Yeah, David Walsh. Yeah,
David Walsh. I don't know if that fits with that guy or not.
David Walsh. His. I'm still working my way through his book. His book is called "The Politics of Person as the Politics of Being," and he is a Catholic personalist who is a defender of liberalism. And views
that the person is defined in community or in relation. Right. And so if you don't have a structure in which those relations hold together. I mean, if you say to a teenager, go find yourself.
Right.
What are you telling them? Go find yourself. How are you going to do that? There's this wide open, undefined field.
Well, that would be maybe a way that you and I both differ from, say, someone like James Lindsay, who I'm perfectly happy to join James Lindsay in the defense of liberalism, but I think Lindsay can't see past the path individualism. He doesn't see any kind of definition of the person that's a relational definition of the person. Yeah. He automatically thinks collectivism, and he can't find this middle space between individualism and collectivism that Christian personalism offers.
Right. And I am with you on the Christian personalism, but I do have a tragic sense about the possibilities in our present culture for that. I think that the culture, the way it's structured now, in many ways undermines our ability to maintain that self-identity.
So let's talk about it in the context for a moment with Paul and the CRC. And it's for Paul to say that the CRC if the CRC conservative has lost face with the post-war consensus, I can cringe about the use of post-war consensus, but ultimately, I don't have any problem with the CRC deciding that for the CRC, their identity as Christian Reformed is very, very important, and they want to protect that their historical identity as a group, because that separation of church and state also allows for them to do that.
Absolutely.
I'm perfectly fine with that. The problem, what I don't want is I don't want a large religious majority to then take that move into the political arena and try and enforce their political or their religious identity on everyone else.
Yes.
But the CRC is free to set up whatever boundaries it wants. And
liberalism, I think, is defined, hundreds of different ways of defining it, but is not defined by the granting of freedoms, but rather the residual restrictions that we're all supposed to agree on. And so you can do anything you want except, and then what happens, what you fill in after the except is the important part of that construct. And violating,
okay. So the illiberalism of woke is actually a great illustration here, right?
Right.
Because the reason that we objected is that what wokeism did is, in the name of freedom and liberty, it tried to enforce your delusional view of yourself on others, which is actually illiberal. So it's like, if you can have, like, you can have whatever vision of yourself that you want. That's your own private business, but you don't get to try to force me to accept whatever delusion you have.
Right. And this just goes right back to the Jordan Peterson moment. He was so right about that moment of saying, you can't make me say whatever it is you are saying. That was absolutely, that's C16. Is that what we refer to that as?
C16 bill,
the C16 moment was so correct. I am a lover of Jordan Peterson as a person, and I hope all good things for him, but I don't necessarily follow a whole lot of his whole journey in terms of, agreement or assent to his positions. But that moment was defining, and it was necessary, and it was exactly what you're talking about.
Well, I think
the problem is there was also the same thing going on the right. And of course, January 6th is it's just, it almost doesn't have to be said that January 6th is the epitome of, a violation of what we would regard those liberal values to be.
Okay, now I want to talk about that. That came up with me and Sam too, where it's like, and that can be an unpopular thing to say, but the people who were very upset about January 6th were not crazy people.
Yeah.
Like the optics of that was a violation of our shared sacred as Americans. It just was.
Absolutely.
And people had a right.
I'm not. I wouldn't hesitate to say that. And I think there's a lot. I do think you can put it in a context. You can say that it was unsuccessful. It was a small group of people. It was it wasn't going to ultimately create a movement beyond itself.
Yeah,
I think
you don't have to say
true.
It was actually seriously a coup attempt. Okay, you don't have to go to the extreme of saying it was a coup in order to accept that it was a bad look. That's all I'm saying.
Bad look. Yeah,
it's a very bad look.
Yeah.
Also, you can see the neo-paganism is on display in that too, right? Because and I mentioned this to Sam too. There's a big neo-pagan undercurrent of this. I was reading this essay. There's a guy in my Discord server who actually translates Bulgakov from the Russian. And he shared with me a Bulgakov essay from 1942 that he wrote called Christianity and Racism. And he is actually talking about the rise of German racialism in the Second World War. And he's specifically talking about a book written by a guy named Rosenberg. And he points out this, and I think he's really on point here. He talks about how the kind of like neo-paganism that we see that gets expressed through these kind of political movements of the right and the left is also neo-pagan. Don't get me wrong; they're both neo-pagan. They're neo-pagan in different directions with different energies, inspired by different principalities and powers. Okay, but they're both pagan. So I'm not singling out just the right, but he points out that it's not the same as the old, like as the paganism of old, which can kind of like get excused because there's a certain naivete to it because of lack of revelation. And so you can kind of excuse it as people just doing their best to relate to the divine in an imperfect and improper way. Okay. So it's not as bad. The ancient paganism is not as bad as what happens when you have people that were brought up fully in a Christian context that then start to veer in this neo-pagan direction, because what happens is that it becomes very quickly anti-Christian. It becomes anti-Christian remains anti-Christian even when it, like the Nazi movement, tries to maintain a kind of nominal connection to Christianity, because it actually ends up completely perverting the gospel. You know, the Nazis like explicitly rejected any notion of love that was not love of honor. That's not Christianity anymore.
Yeah, I would say that. Yeah, I agree with you. I would say that, this then goes to another big theme in my Substack, and really has been something that I realize is deeply embedded in my way of wanting to work these things out. And that is grappling with, in a way, what you just said. And that is that, that there's a Christianity that I am devoted to. I am a Christian, but that has a certain contour to it, a certain shape to it that you have pointed to. And I hear, it's kind of the version of Christianity that Tom Holland is ready to describe, the foundational document of Genesis defining the dignity of the individual, right, and that getting expressed in terms of Jesus' sacrificial act, which defines the only moral, the only appropriate use of power is the protection of the weak and the innocent, and that leads to the all of the kind of laudable values that both Glenn Scrivener and Tom Holland are painting as the Christian tradition that we inherit. But I struggle with that. And the reason I struggle with it is that there are many Christianities. I don't know if you saw the conversation between Elizabeth Oldfield and Mark Vernon, but I wrote a piece about that.
I did see it.
Huh?
I did see it, but go ahead and let me hear what you have to say.
I wrote a piece about that because I really was touched by that conversation, because they both are in a way struggling in a similar way to you and I and Sam on this, in that they're noticing this move that in Christian circles, and they're both Christians, so they take this personally in directions that they worry about, that they don't recognize as Christian, and that then becomes this problem of Christian pluralism, of the plurality of what is explicitly identified, self-identified as Christian in the world that we encounter, and also in the history of Christianity. And I've said this way before, in that I don't regard the problem of evil as a particularly difficult problem from a Christian perspective, because it's not just a Christian problem. It's a problem that we all face. And therefore atheists have to struggle with this, and they have to put a construct around it. They have to deal with it.
That's right.
But Christian history is a problem for Christians, because it's their tradition. And I kind of, in a way, because of my background and everything, I kind of feel like I feel that more deeply than maybe is even healthy for me. I don't know. But I struggle with trying to formulate a Christian a sense of my own commitment to my Christian faith in the face of these multiple Christianities that I see as explicit expressions of things that I find repulsive, both in history and in our broader culture. New apostolic Reformation participation in January 6th being an example of that.
Yeah. Okay. So Jem, I think I don't know if you saw the conversation I had with Brian Sartor on Jordan Peterson's God.
Yeah.
But I think this is what you were just talking about I think this is one of the reasons that Jordan remains on the fence.
Yeah.
Because he sees the kind of propositional infighting that exists like across Christianity and the emphasis on beliefism. And he sees that he is wise enough to realize that it's inherently a problem.
Right.
It's inherently
I feel that myself. And I just, I don't know. Yeah, we could have a whole nother conversation and maybe more than that, and trying for me to try to articulate the way I formulate my own faith. But I really feel the need in me to have my faith, have part of my faith be the rejection of that, of those other aspects of what is
but right. But here's the thing though, you don't need to propositionally reject it. Like, you really don't. Like, that actually getting caught up in arguing about it does no one any good. Yep. The way that you properly reject it is to just act out the vision of Christianity that you see in your life.
Totally. And it is my move. In a way, that is my move, different than, let's say, Tom Holland, who I think I probably agree with on almost everything in terms of the metaphysical construct that he lives within, except I'm just willing to say I'm a Christian. I believe this. Right. And in a way similar to I think doing what you're advising there, different than Jordan Peterson is. Jordan Peterson is he's caught up in the anxiety of that battle of trying to figure that out, and I'm just ready to say
I think so. I think maybe he's waiting for it. He's waiting for like there to be like some sort of like perfect system of Christianity that matches matches his own propositions, which is somewhat ironic because he's actually primarily what he's saying is that your propositions don't matter.
Yeah.
And so I think that, which is why he doesn't bother me, because when he says that he acts as if God exists, I believe him, because the way he behaves demonstrates that he's not just saying that.
Yeah.
Right. The way he acts in the world aligns with the words that come out of his mouth. And this is why, and I think he's right to point toward like faith is an action. Faith is a doing. There's a reason why Jesus referred to himself as the way, right?
Yeah.
It's a path. It's a mode of being. It's not a set of propositions. It's not the kind of truth that Jesus is not a truth that is just a fact in the world, because things that are just facts in the world aren't ultimately that consequential.
Yeah. So a lot of my effort goes to trying to formulate ways of expressing these ideas. One of them is that I talked to Paul about this prior to Chino. I don't see myself as having had a conversion into Christianity. And,
that's very interesting. Even though you were raised secular, you feel like you were just, okay.
I've written another piece about this, which I'm about to post on Substack, but basically here's a story for you that'll, I think, illustrate this. I grew up in this secular environment that I've just described, and my family was aligned with another family, and there was a young child my age in that family, and we were kind of both forced together, but also became, tight friends because our family stayed very close together through, all the way through into my adulthood, and then, in fact, all the way up until his death. And the scenario was that he had a more troubled life than I did. He had a difficult relationship with his father. He also had some degree of social, difficulties in terms of integrating into navigating the social world, but also the academic world. And so as we grew up, we knew each other before we could think. And as we grow up, we're in school together. And there were moments, and this became more and more the case, that I was moving past him. I was moving away from him. I was moving into circles that he couldn't follow me into, and he was being left behind. And this was true even at a very young age, but it became more and more obvious as we grew into adulthood. And I felt a deep obligation to try and help him in some way. And I also recognized while this was happening that I wasn't living up to that obligation to the degree that I could have even. Mm-hmm. And so as time goes by, he has more difficult trials with his father dying at a young age, and he ends up dying at a young age, not because of suicide or because of like drug addiction or anything, but because of a health problem that ultimately, was compounded by this situation of him not finding a home or not being able to be more successful, both socially and in all other ways. And it had great impact on me because I felt both the pain of my own failure, my own failure to live up to that obligation, and the need for some sort of forgiveness about that. I went to his mother at his funeral, and I had this moment of very kind of passionate pain, and I realized in that moment that she did not have the power to forgive me of this sin. Now, I also recognized all along that I wasn't able to fix this problem. This problem was far bigger than me or him even. And so it was far beyond me. So it wasn't that I was responsible for what happened to him. Nonetheless, I failed my obligation to him in real ways. And so now as a Christian, I look back on that and I see it as I see it as the human experience here as expressed through a Christian drama. We are weak. We fail we sin, to use the term. We have obligations that we fail to live up to. We need forgiveness. That forgiveness is not going to come within the context of the imminent frame. And we need grace. We need something beyond that particular experience. No one in the world, his mother or anybody else, was going to able to give me the absolution that I needed. And yet, all of that happened without an explicit Christian context.
Right.
And now I frame it in that Christian context, but I still feel the same. In other words, the fact that I see myself now as Christian, that drama was very Christian in its structure.
Right. This is why I always say my definition of the way I define a Christian. Paul has his own definition. What does he say? A Christian is someone who trusts Jesus more than himself, which I'm not reacting against Paul's definition.
Yep. Agreed.
Which is fine, but my definition is that a Christian is someone whose mode of being is attempting to conform to the pattern of Christ. Now, it can be doing that without any propositional knowledge, right?
Exactly. That's the point of me telling that story.
You can have, in fact, you can even have the wrong propositions and still be living the right pattern.
You're right. And in fact, we do. And in fact, we both feel the obligation. We recognize the obligation as an important part of the world in our lives, but we also fail. And we also not just fail, but need absolution because we fail, because we are going to fail. And in any case, I see it structured in my, Christian vocabulary and Christian categories, but I don't think I was lacking that then.
Right.
In other words, I think I was living that in the fullness that it requires. And therefore, in that individual who I was fully in alignment, if you will, with, I don't know what, Jim,
we run into huge, if we really want to make it about the propositions, we run into a huge problem really quickly.
Right.
Because what do you do about someone who doesn't have the intellectual capacity to grasp the propositions?
Absolutely. So anyway, that's why I say, well,
those people exist, right? And
in a certain sense, I was a Christian then, and now I'm just same guy, and I'm a Christian now. And I agree with what you're hinting at. There is something that I also think needs to be a part of my own faith, and that is the explicit statement that explicit Christianity is neither necessary nor sufficient. And that doesn't mean that it's not needed for me. It is needed for me, but in the broadest sense, it's neither necessary nor sufficient.
But Jim, do you see the way in which what we're talking about right now is actually a major defense of liberalism? Because in as much as you can get people to think along these lines, then you begin to have the ability for our liberal society to function again, because you are allowing people to access something without necessarily having to assent to a set of propositions. And that can give us a kind of like shared, cultural, I don't know what to call it. I mean, a kind of like implicit Christianity that isn't necessarily a dogmatic propositional Christianity, which you got from your secular upbringing within a Christian liberal culture.
And, and what it was the experience of it. What it was the reality of being in a connection with another human being. In a certain way, I was the only one who was, because I was his peer. No one else was his peer. So I was the one who was the closest to him. I was his one version of his possibility of someone, being alongside him. And that's our state. We are in relation to each other, to use the terms that you guys, we are in relation to each other. We can't not be in relation to each other. And
like that, there's no experience of personhood that it does not involve you being, even if we weren't talking together right now, even if you were is that your office, even if you were in your office alone, your experience of reality is still going to be fundamentally relational, because you're going to be interacting with something in your environment.
I carry this guy around with me. I carry my family around with me. My parents, they're all, giving me the material with which I move from day to day.
Right. Yeah. And the thing about personalism that makes it preferable to collectivism is that the personalism still recognizes the inherent worth and dignity of every single individual person in a way that collectivism does not. Like collectivism just expects you to sacrifice for your group identity. Period.
So thanks for letting me deviate into that personal story. It
was great.
A little bit away from the theme that we were trying to talk about, but I do think that it's going to be that conversation between Elizabeth Oldfield and Mark Vernon. I think is interesting in that Elizabeth Oldfield's going to be at Midwestuary.
Right.
And I think there's really a difference between the way she is talking and, let's say, the way Dreer is talking.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's going to be very interesting. There's a lot of variety there, let's say.
She's going to bring a very different perspective. It's interesting because it's like she's certainly no less Christian than Rod is.
Right.
But they do have very different perspectives.
Yeah. And, I like Rod Dreer. He's fun to watch.
I do too.
He's very, he's got a very, a lot to his personality. He's putting a lot out there when he speaks, and it's just a very interesting contrast between her kind of there's a kind of disappointed pathos in Elizabeth Oldfield that I saw in that conversation. Of course, I feel a different kind of let's say confidence out of Rod Dreer in terms of the way he speaks, kind of projecting a set of ideas and a set of kind of points maybe related to the conversation I had with Sam concerning re-enchantment. He is kind of enamored with the re-enchantment narrative, and it's going to be very interesting. It's going to be very interesting.
Yeah. So let's yeah. I know you talked about that with Sam. Like that was kind of the emphasis of your conversation with Sam.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a connection to your wariness about enchantment, and there's actually a connection with the political question, because there's a way in which liberalism kind of works hand in hand with modernism, because the modernism kind of gives attempts to give a way of evaluating claims that is accessible to everyone.
Yep.
And that attempts to put all claims on an equal playing field. And obviously, we can be honest about acknowledging its shortcomings without saying, well, we should just throw that all out altogether, and then we should just fully embrace enchantment, because Hitler was doing some enchantment.
Yeah, I would be happier with those who indulge in the re-enchantment narrative if they were willing to own it more fully and talk about how it's supposed to create a coherent image of the world. And I don't see that. I can't formulate a way in which a 16th century monk levitating fits into a cosmos that makes any sense. And, and so that, and I mean that in the fully, if I were to put my fully devotional cap on and say, all right, I'm going to buy all of I'm going to try to buy all of this narrative. And it doesn't make any sense to me that there would be this random, arbitrary, miraculous event in 16th century for whatever reason.
Right. Compare that.
Arbitrary, and mixed in with, demonic versions of the same happening, in the country next door. That can't be formulated in my mind into a coherent kind of cosmological worldview. And importantly, those who indulge in that don't even try to make it a coherent image of the world.
And it doesn't really resemble the miracles of Jesus in any way either. It's just it does have the sort of an arbitrariness about it. If you compare those claims to like the way that C.S. Lewis talks about the miracles of Christ, and how the miracles of Christ are kind of like, they're all derived from nature, but they're just like kind of accelerations of what normally happens in natural processes, rather than like, they don't actually overturn the laws of nature. They just, are special cases of the laws of nature operating at a different rate or in a different mode than normal. And so levitation is different. I don't know. Levitation seems to be different. And certainly most of the history of reports of levitation are outside of a Christian context. So it makes sense to me to question that.
Yeah, I see the miracles in the New Testament a little bit, well, not that much different, but different. I think almost, not all of them, but a lot of them, if not almost all of them, represented challenges to the temple cult, in which carried forward the Levitical laws into a kind of culture in which there was exclusivity based on various physical features, like, let's say, skin diseases, or being blind or being lame. Those are people who were specifically enumerated in the Levitical laws to be excluded from the temple. And so, bleeding, definitely, a woman who has her menses can do a process after the completion of her menses to gain access back to the temple through a sacrificial kind of cleansing. But a woman who's bleeding continuously cannot do that.
Right. But my point is that bodies heal naturally.
Yep.
And so when Jesus in performing miracles of healing isn't doing anything that violates laws of nature, it's just an extraordinary case of acceleration of the processes.
Right. I understand that logic.
Yeah.
But the way in which they are the way in which they're included in the narrative is, in a way, I think, a move towards universal.
I'm not denying that they also have that they also have that additional symbolic element of pointing toward in that direction as well. I don't think you're wrong about that.
Yeah. The other, I would, and again, this would extend this conversation out beyond where we maybe would want.
Go ahead. Yeah. Something I want to say about Rod's book specifically, though.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time in Christianity nowadays trying to look back at the context in which these narratives were written in order to help us to understand them. Of course, that's an impossible task because there's too many contexts. What is the context of the Song of Deborah versus the Book of Isaiah versus, these are hundreds of years of cultural evolution all the way up into including the New Testament. But that contextualization implies, and this is going to be, I'm probably going to mess this up logically speaking, so you're going to have to help me here, but that implies that our faith is contextual.
Mm-hmm.
And that means to me, and I'm just going to make this jump, that means to me that there is another task that we need to do, which is to fit our faith into our present context, fully into our present context. And so that's where I don't know if that.
I would say what we need to do is, I think Peterson's right in defining faith, and that the challenge before you is to embody it in your immediate context.
Right. Yeah. In any case, so that's where I want
act it out in your words and your deeds.
Which and it's true. Yeah, I agree with that. And then I would go the next step, which I was saying before, is we act it out, but it's actually more complex than that because we can guarantee to ourselves that we are going to fail. And as we fail, we're going to be experiencing the burden of our sin.
But
and then we're going to need to submit ourselves.
Perseverance is also an action.
Right. But that's what I mean. It's that fullness. It's the fullness of that drama that is always ever present for us.
I think that's where
acting it out, realizing we're failing, needing forgiveness, needing grace.
Right. Well, you need faith, hope, and charity, right? So,
yeah, that's right. That's right.
So that's
anyway. Back to Rod. What were you going to say about?
Yeah, I want to say Roger about the enchantment thing. It's like, and this actually plays into maybe we don't want to throw modernism out altogether, because I just think his claim that he wants to believe the UAP phenomenon, but then he just wants to automatically jump to the conclusion that it's just demons.
Right.
And that's to me, it's if you want to try to evaluate these things and at least to maybe consider taking them seriously, any kind of, if you look at the actual case studies for any length of time, just saying demons is an insufficient explanation.
Yeah.
It might fit some of the cases, but it doesn't fit all of the cases. And that's not good enough, Rod.
This is what I meant. And in the article I wrote about both Paul Vanderklay and the telepathy tapes, but also Carlos Ayers, They Flew, is that this is a rhetorical strategy. They're gesturing at something. They're indulging in an individual example and using it kind of as a chink in the armor of the modernists, if you will. But they're not ready to carry that through in its fullness. And they're, I feel like it's a kind of strategic thing. It's a kind of a rhetorical movement, that I don't know that in any of the conversations, including Carlos Ayer himself, who wrote the book, or Paul Vanderklay, or Cale Zeldin, and I'm terrible to call people out by name, but I don't think any one of them were ready to say something blunt like Joseph of Cupertino did levitate.
Mm-hmm.
They're not saying that. They're saying, oh, lots of witnesses said that he did. So you have to take that into account.
Right.
And isn't it weird that we hear all these stories? And isn't it interesting that these things keep coming up? Right. Well, that's a half step. That's not a full step into what you're talking about metaphysically.
Yeah, and of course, like, I get it, because the move of doubting eyewitness accounts is a very modern move.
Right.
And there's something to be said. There is, in fact, something to be said for challenging, like, how much suspicion should we be casting on eyewitness accounts? Should we really just discount eyewitness evidence altogether when we're evaluating things, or if we have to reason to suspect that someone is a credible witness, maybe we should at least take what they're saying into consideration. I think that doesn't warrant necessarily jumping to the conclusion that Joseph of Cupertino levitated. It can be possible that you can accept that the witnesses weren't lying and still entertain that there's some. I don't know. I haven't read the book, and I don't really know what the evidence is. So I'm in no position to evaluate it whatsoever. But I think that it's not the idea of, like, wanting to push back on the automatic skepticism toward eyewitness testimony is not an entirely bad thing, as long as you keep in mind that the reason modernity rejected eyewitness testimony is also, like, based in reality, that there are legitimate reasons to question the trustworthiness of eyewitness accounts, like this, and it's been demonstrated over and over again.
For me, this is a reflection of the fact that we still live in an age of epistemic anxiety. Right. And we are constantly thinking of epistemology as first philosophy, if you will. We're thinking of every question boils down to, how did you know that? Right. And then a justification for how you know that is what's demanded. And then if you do that, you're going to start to weigh these different pieces of evidence, like the witnesses, and you're going to start to say, well, wait a minute, if I have a lot of witnesses, then, wow, that has a weight, and therefore it needs to be taken into account. I would start before that, and I would say, we need to have ultimate confidence in us being given a facility for engaging with the world. Mm-hmm. The way in which we make these judgments about whether Joseph of Cupertino levitated is complicated, and it comes from lots of different directions. It includes kind of what seems, our own personal experience. It includes our education. It includes rational principles like the world is consistent and it's well ordered. It includes inductive principles like the addition of additional evidence, and none of those things trump any of the other ones, and they come together in a way that ultimately is going to be a judgment. It's not going to be, a cut and dried thing, and it's our epistemic anxiety that makes us want that last absolute case to be made.
Well, this is why I think John Vervaeke is such a superlative example of someone who is doing a really good job of not wanting to throw out the entirety of the modern toolkit. He remains a person who is dedicated to the scientific method, but he also knows he's also very consciously aware of what its limitations are, and where it can't really be brought to bear. So it's like he's a scientist who has enough intellectual honesty and humility to realize that there are certain questions that are beyond the capability of the scientific method to answer. that doesn't mean we throw it out, right? So it doesn't mean that.
Yeah, and we have to make judgments in the end, and we know that those judgments are, kind of in the end fraught with all the fallacies that are out there, and yet we have to move forward and we have to do it anyway. And I don't.
That's actually, by the way, and I would say that both the atheists and the fundamentalists are both trying to evade judgment. Like that's actually what they're trying to get out of. They're both seeking a kind of certainty that's not actually accessible to them in order to evade judgment. But we have to make judgments. That's just our lot as human beings, is we have to evaluate and we have to make judgments. And those judgments always end up causing actions. And sometimes we end up doing the wrong thing and making the wrong judgments, but we can't get out of that necessity to act in the world.
Yeah, or another way of putting that is not acting is just as much of an action as acting is. Yeah. And so we're stuck there.
And has consequences in the same way that acting does. Yeah. Right. Yeah, absolutely. So
anyway, what else? What other thoughts do you have, Nate?
I just think that that's kind of like that. I think that's a nice summation. Is like, hey, modernity and liberalism have given us a lot of good things. Maybe we shouldn't be rushing to just immediately move beyond them, and that we actually don't know what's coming. We still don't know what's coming after. Whatever, if there is a post-liberalism, we don't know what it looks like because we haven't really seen it in action yet, at least not here. I think we've seen some post-liberal moves in Europe, I would say. We've seen that, and I think that they have not necessarily... The results haven't been anything that encourages me to say, yeah, that's totally the direction we should go in this country politically. I don't see any great post-liberal success stories coming out of the European experiments in a post-liberal direction. And also, the Europeans were always less committed to liberalism than we were, and it's a different environment. And so I think the idea of taking European political ideas and applying them on American soil is pretty dumb, and it's not likely to yield very good results. And I still think that we need modernism. And one of the reasons that we need modernism is that if we are entering into a more enchanted era, we are going to need the bullshit detection tools of modernism more than we ever have.
Yep.
And we should not be throwing that toolkit away in favor of just believing everything that is put out there, because there are lots of things that are total nonsense that will end up being destructive for us.
Yeah. Well said. So, I would say the same. I would say I'm going to stick to my frame of being a reactionary classical liberal in the sense that I both think I want to continue to defend those principles. I want to do that with some nuance, with some realization, like we tried to talk about before, that there are problems with that, the choice or the historical fact that we've moved into this world through this process of, let's say, the liberal consensus, the classical liberal consensus, has inherent to it problems that we need to, at least try and compensate for. But that does not mean that we should abandon those principles, and that that one important bottom line to recognize is that those principles are only as strong as our participation and belief in them is. Yeah. And if we just kind of willy-nilly grab onto some other sexy new system that seems to attract us, we take a big risk by doing that.
And it's important to remember that any system you develop is going to have some sort of loophole that can be exploited, and that we're always going to have to be patching those problems.
Right.
And so I think what we've done, what's happened is we've noticed some loopholes that within the system that we have. And I think what needs to be done is to patch the loopholes rather than trash the entire system.
Right. And maybe some hope, again, maybe some hope in the history of the last 10 years or more, but the history of the last 10 years, in that while we've delved into some very difficult moments that seem to be kind of off track and perhaps driving off the side of the road, it seems like in many of those cases, we've drifted back. The systems that we are committed to, have seemed to hold, even though they're deeply flawed. I think our political system is deeply,
well, it seems like conservatives want to at this moment, like the conservatives are almost acting as if they want to seize defeat from the jaws of victory, because if they were more modest and incremental in their approach, they could enjoy the victory over woke on the left.
Exactly.
But instead,
there also is there seems to be this lurch in one direction here that we've been experiencing since Trump's reelection. But in a certain sense, you watch that lurch happen, and they're softening those moves a bit, and that seems to me to kind of mean that maybe 6 months from now it'll be kind of drifting back a little bit, and we won't get the most extreme versions of the rhetoric. In our actual,
I don't know. We'll see what happens after the New York mayoral race.
Oh my gosh! There's always reason to fear. There's always reason to fear.
Well, we're Christians. We don't have any reason to be.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right.
We'll be okay. We'll be okay no matter what.
Yeah.
So there's nothing to fear. Jim, it was really great talking to you.
I appreciate it.
We'll talk again. I'll see you in Chicago.
Conversation. I appreciate you indulging my wandering a bit, but
I've been known to wander myself from time to time.
And it helps me to work these things out. I don't think I have anything firmly worked out yet, and that's part of the deal.
I look forward to the reaction from my post-liberal friends.
Yeah. All right, Nate. Hey, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye, Jim.